Welcome back to class. We are in chapter 2 and we are defining important macroeconomic variables. In the first part of this lecture, we have talked about GDP and we defined GDP. And now we will talk about the inflation rate and the unemployment rate. As you can see here, we have two different ways to define the inflation rate. One is the GDP deflator and one is the consumer price index. Let's talk about these two different concepts and start with the GDP deflator. If the nominal GDP increases to a larger extent than real GDP, this is due to an increase of the price level. The price increases can be measured by the change in the GDP deflator, and the GDP deflator in the year T is defined as the ratio of nominal GDP over real GDP. So here the GDP deflator is defined in equation 2. In the basis year, the GDP deflator takes a value of 1 or 100%. The GDP deflator is an index number, which implies that the level has no economic meaning at all. We can only interpret changes of the GDP deflator as the inflation rate. And here we also have two different ways how we can compute inflation. Like one is, we say the inflation rate is equal to the GDP deflator in year T minus the GDP deflator in T minus 1 divided by the GDP deflator in T minus 1. For example, here in year T minus 1, the GDP deflator was on a level of 120. And in T, the GDP deflator increased to 121.4. So the inflation rate is like 2%. A second possibility how to compute the inflation rate is by log differencing. Here we have the natural log of the GDP deflator in T, or here we have the natural log of the GDP deflator in T minus 1, and we compute the log difference. When we do so in our numerical example, we also get the information that the inflation rate is almost equal to 2%. A second possibility to compute an inflation rate is by using a consumer price index. Frequently, computer price indexes are constructed by using the last pair index, and here you can see the formula for the last pair index. This formula looks a little bit complicated, but I would like to guide you through this formula. How is the person from the statistical office calculating this last pair index? First of all, the person needs a shopping list. He needs to know what an average household is consuming, and then he's going to the supermarket. So for example, he's putting 5 bananas into the shopping cart. Afterwards, 3 liters of milk and 1 cheese, and also like some beer are on the shopping list, and all these stuff goes into the shopping cart. So what I'm talking about here is QI0. The guy is going shopping in period 0, and on his shopping list are a lot of different items. The index runs from 1 to n, so overall there are n different goods in the shopping cart of this guy from the statistical office. Afterwards, the guy arrives at the counter, and the person at the counter is scanning all the different items and is attaching the price to the quantity. So price times quantity, this occurs in the supermarket when the different items are scanned at the counter. So the price is attached to the quantity. In the end, the person at the counter says the sum for this shopping cart is equal to 100 euros. So you have to pay 100 euros, and hence the denominator of this fraction is determined. 1 year later, this guy from the statistical office goes shopping once more, And please have a look at the shopping list. The shopping list is constant. So once more, we need 5 bananas, 3 liters of milk, a cheese, and some beer. And we are constructing the same shopping cart, the same basket of goods as 1 year before. But now when we arrive at the counter 1 year later, of course, it might be the case that the prices have changed and the guy at the counter is attaching the actual prices in year 1 to the quantities. In the end, the person at the counter says, okay, the price of this basket of goods is 102. And then when we compare the 102 with the sum of the shopping list 1 year before, which was 100, we can once more compute the inflation rate, which will be equal to 2%. So this Laspeyres index looks a little bit complicated because of the sum signs, but it's easy. Like here we have the quantities are constant over time, but of course the prices will change over time. And then the Laspeyres index can be computed. Relative changes of the Laspeyres index can be interpreted as the inflation rate. There are some problems when we use this kind of Laspeyres price index because of the fact that the quantity structure of our shopping cart, like the quantity structure of the basket of goods, is constant over time. And one is the substitution effect. I also would like to use a real-world example to explain this substitution effect. Let's assume that there was a very bad harvest in the banana region, and therefore the price of bananas increased from the level of €1 to the level of 10 euros. How would like a German housewife react in case that the banana price increased from €1 to 10 euros? She would avoid to buy the very expensive bananas and would directly substitute the bananas by buying more apples or more kiwis. So the bananas are substituted because of the fact that they are more expensive. And when the German housewife arrives at the counter, maybe in year 1, the German housewife also pays 100 for the basket of goods, so that the actual inflation rate for the German households is equal to 0. No price increase at all because the expensive goods are directly substituted by less expensive goods. But of course, the guy from the statistical office has to stick to the quantity structure and therefore the measured price increase. The official inflation rate will be higher compared to the actual inflation rate. So there is a bias in this measurement, and this bias is clearly upwards, so that the officially measured inflation rate is higher than the actual one. A second problem is discounters. Like the guy from the statistical office does not only have one shopping list, but has several shopping lists, like for Edeka, and the next one is for Rewe. Let's assume that directly next to the Edeka, a Lidl or an Aldi discounter is opened. How would the German housewife react? The German housewife would directly switch from the high-end supermarkets Edeka and Rewe and go shopping in the discounters in Aldi or Lidl. So directly one would buy like the usual goods in the Aldi and Lidl, and only the very high premium goods would be bought in Rewe and Edeka. But the guy from the statistical office has to keep the quantity structure constant. So also the supermarkets have to be constant, and the guy from the statistical office has to shop in Edeka and Rewe and is not allowed to switch to Aldi and Lidl. Only after time, like only after 5 years, he's allowed to adjust the quantity structure. This discounter effect also leads to a bias upwards. The officially measured inflation rate is higher than the actual inflation rate. There are some more problems, for example, innovations of goods and services. Some new goods, of course, they enter the quantity structure of the household, but they will only affect the shopping list of the guy from the statistical office after some delay. So innovations of goods and services, they are directly in the consumption basket of the private household, but not directly in the consumption basket of the guy from the statistical office. Then quality changes, like a computer at Aldi always costed like 500 German marks. 500 German marks when I was young, and when I grew up and computers were sold at Aldi, it was always 500 marks, 500 marks, 500 marks. Then the euro was introduced and it was 500 euros, 500 euros, 500 euros. But of course, the quality of the computers changed over time. Like the computers today, they have far more power compared to my first computer. Like my first computer was a Commodore C16. It had 16 kilobyte RAM. Like each and every email today is of a larger size compared to 16 kilobyte. So my first computer had a lower quality compared to the computers today, despite the fact that the prices are the same. Let's talk a little bit about the difference between the consumer price index and the GDP deflator. Like the GDP deflator is a measure of the average price index of all final goods produced within our economy. The consumer price index is a measure for the average price of consumer goods. And there might be a difference between the goods which are produced and the goods which are consumed by the private consumer. The consumer price index is calculated on a monthly basis, while the GDP deflator is only computed on a quarterly basis, because we only have GDP numbers on a quarterly basis. Afterwards, Eurostat will calculate the inflation rate for the entire euro area by using like the harmonized index of consumer prices. Like all the national offices, they calculate the inflation rate for on the national level, and Eurostat afterwards aggregates the inflation rate to the inflation rate of the euro area. Harmonized implies that the different statistical offices, they should measure the national inflation rate in a harmonized way so that it's easier in the end for Eurostat to aggregate the inflation rates. Can there be a difference between the GDP deflator and the consumer price index? Let's check. Here you can see a red line, the consumer price index, and a black line, the GDP deflator for Germany over time. We can definitely say that these two measures are positively correlated, so there is a very strong positive correlation. But sometimes there are some deviations between the red line and the black line. Why is that? Some goods which are produced in the German economy, they are not used as consumption goods because of the fact that these goods are used for investments by the companies. They are used by the government in form of government spending, like for example police cars, or it might be the case that some goods which are produced in the German economy, they are exported to foreign countries. Like the prices of those goods, they don't affect the local consumer price index. But of course, they will affect the GDP deflator. Furthermore, some goods which are consumed in the German economy, they are not produced in the German economy. For example, Barbies. Barbies are produced in China, and therefore it will be the case that Chinese price fluctuations, they affect like the German consumer price index, but they don't affect the German GDP deflator. So let's sum up: a very high correlation between the two inflation rates, but sometimes there is a smaller difference. We have talked a lot about inflation. Let's talk a little bit about the cost of inflation. In case that the inflation rate is high and constant, the cost of inflation are relatively low. Because of the fact that the inflation rate is constant, adjustments can be made because the inflation rate can be anticipated and incorporated in all expectations. Let's assume, for example, that the inflation rate is 10%, so a relatively high inflation rate, but then it is possible to increase nominal wages by 10% each year. It is possible to set up rent contracts so that the rent increases by 10% each year. So we have no expectations errors, and therefore costs are relatively low. But here it is said that the transaction costs are higher in a setting where the inflation rate is 10% compared to a situation where the inflation rate is 2%. This is due to the fact that, for example, price lists have to be printed. In case that the inflation rate is 10%, we have to adjust the price list frequently. And price lists, these can be price lists within a company, catalogs, for example, or it could also be the menu card in a restaurant. Like all this stuff has to be adjusted more frequently in case that the inflation rate is higher. And therefore, these kind of adjustments cause some costs for the society. When the inflation rate is high and variable, then redistribution takes place because prices and wages do not adjust simultaneously. We have a redistribution between employed persons and pensioners because the pensions are not adjusted in the same way as the wages. We also have redistribution effect between borrowers and lenders, and the tax progression leads to higher tax revenues at the side of the government. When the inflation rate is high and variable, this also will increase the uncertainty, and the households and the companies, they don't have a good basis to build their expectations. Why is that important? Like when some prices increase, the private households and the companies are never sure, is this price increase due to the fact that the inflation rate is high and variable, or is it due to the fact that there is a high demand for that kind of good? When there is an increase in demand which is causing this price increase, then it would be a clear signal, for example, for companies to invest in this field and to increase production capacity. Now I would like to talk about the third important macroeconomic variable, the unemployment rate. First of all, let's clarify some terms. The labor force L consists out of employed people N and the unemployed people U. The unemployment rate is calculated in the following rate. The unemployment rate U is equal to the number of people which are unemployed U divided by the labor force L. It seems to be very easy to judge who is employed, but difficult to decide whether a person is unemployed and is seeking for employment. One source to get information about the number of people which are unemployed is stemming from the Federal Employment Agency of Germany, like the Bundesagentur für Arbeit. But the incentive to declare unemployment depends on whether a person receives unemployment benefits and how much unemployment benefits are expected, and also the likelihood to receive a job offer through this institution. In case that a person believes that the likelihood of getting a job does not increase by walking over to the Federal Employment Agency, and this person is also not entitled to get unemployment benefits, there is no incentive to declare unemployment. So another possibility to compute the unemployment rate is another method to compute the unemployment rate is stemming from the International Labour Organization, ILO. According to the definition of the ILO, one person is unemployed if he or she confesses in an interview that he's without a job, that the person is able to begin a job within 2 weeks, and that the person has tried to find a job by himself or herself within the last 4 weeks. These criteria are valid independent of whether a person is registered as unemployed or not. So, according to the ILO concept, an interview takes place and the interviewer asks, do you have a job? Yes or no? Are you able to begin a job within the next 2 weeks? And have you looked for a job by yourself? And when you get 3 yeses, then it's a case that this person is unemployed. Registered unemployed who do not want to work are not in the labor force according to the ILO concept, like those people who are registered at the federal office but do not want to work. They are not unemployed according to the ILO concept. When we make international comparisons of unemployment rates, it would also make sense to use numbers from the ILO because international comparisons only make sense when we measure the same incidences with the same methods. In Germany, it was the case that until 2004, only once a year an assessment occurred based on the ILO concept. So when you look at unemployment numbers according to the ILO concept before 2004, you don't find them on a monthly basis, but only on a yearly basis. The Statistical Office used the so-called microcensus, where about 1% of all German households are interviewed on a yearly basis. But since 2005, the Federal Statistical Office, like the Statistische Bundesamt, uses monthly telephone questionnaires according to the ILO standard. So from 2005 onwards, you'll find monthly data. Here you can see the unemployment rate according to the so-called ILO standard. And in June 2020, the unemployment rate according to ILO was 4.5% in the German economy. In June 2020, the officially measured unemployment rate was 6.2%. So there is a big difference between the unemployment rate according to ILO and the unemployment rate according to the federal office. The difference is 1.7 percentage points. So there is a big difference between these two different measures. In the last slide, we compare the development of the unemployment rate in the US and in Germany. Especially here in 2008-2009, there is a big difference. Like the financial crisis in 2008 and the economic crisis in 2009 led to a sharp increase of the unemployment rate in the US, but more or less nothing happened to the German unemployment rate. It is the case that here the unemployment rate in the US doubled from 5% to 10%. Then the unemployment rate stayed constant for a longer time period, and decreased from 2010 onwards. Like in 2019, it was the case that the unemployment rate in the US was clearly below the unemployment rate in Germany, but this also changed during the recent corona crisis, and we will update the unemployment figures for Germany and the US within this lecture. So you will definitely see some more actual data in this lecture. Thank you very much for attending this lecture. Have a nice day. Bye-bye.